Hi everyone, and welcome to Compliance Panel's live webinar on process validation for medical device manufacturers. My name is David Benjamin, and I'm going to be a host for today. And on behalf of Compliance Panel team, I would like to thank you for being part of this event. Now, today's webinar will be presented by Mr. Edwin Bills. During his 20-year career in a medical device, Mr. Bills has held a number of quality and regulatory affairs positions. Mr. Bills is ASQ certified as quality engineer, quality auditor, and as manager of quality organizational improvement. He is also regulatory affairs certified through the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society and obtained BS and master's degrees from the University of Cincinnati. Recently, Mr. Bills served as U.S. Industry Co-Chair for the Association of Advancement of Medical Device Instrumentation Committee, QMWGO4, on application of risk management to medical device, and participated in the development of ISO 14971 risk management standard for medical devices. Mr. Bills is current member of the U.S. National Committee on Medical Device Risk Management. Mr. Bills has presented training courses for American Association of Medical Instrumentation in the area of risk management and quality systems, and presented courses at the University of Southern California and the University of Washington in their regulatory affairs graduate programs. He's also authored several articles on medical device risk management, and currently Mr. Bills is the principal consultant at Bylangs Consulting LLC in the area of medical device, quality, regulatory, product liability, and risk management. Now, before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outline for this training session. The webinar is for 90 minutes duration. First, Mr. Bills will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he will then share with you his presentation. We would like to inform all participants once part of the teleconference have been placed on mute and will remain so until the Q&A session begins towards the end of the webinar. It is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing our presenter to speak clearly so that everyone present can take maximum benefit from this event. We also request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of the training session or the teleconference, we request you all to follow the same procedure to join in again. And now that we are all ready to start, I request Mr. Bills to take it from here. Ed?
Very good. Thank you, David. Appreciate the introduction, and welcome to everyone for this Compliance Panel live webinar. And somebody's not muted there, but anyway, we're discussing process validation for medical device manufacturers in today's session, and we will, as David said, take questions at the end of the session regarding this. You may either type questions in the chat panel, or we'll open it up for audio questions at the end. So for today, things we're going to cover include how does the United States Food and Drug Administration interpret the Global Harmonization Task Force guidance document on process validation. We're also going to look at why should a company validate production processes. We're going to investigate what processes require validation, because there are some very specific requirements for certain processes. We're going to look at how process validation relates to design validation, because there is a very specific linkage to these two different processes, one which is in manufacturing, process validation, and of course design validation is attached to the design process. We're going to talk about a little bit about process validation and how that relates to other quality techniques like Six Sigma and SPC. We're going to look at some specific statistical tools that can be used to conduct process validation and the value that they have in assisting with that process. Okay, process validation has been a requirement for both the drug and device manufacturers for many years. The current FDA's process validation guidance was actually produced in 1987. And it's still in use by CDER, or the Center for Device Evaluation and Research, and CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research. Those two groups are still using the current document, although, as we'll see later, there is a draft of a new document which has been created, and hopefully someday soon they will move over to that newer draft. Much of the process validation information and guidance is available all over the place. There's, of course, the GHTF guidance, the FDA's guidance. There's courses available that last much more than the hour that we have today. That information is out there, but still we have manufacturers struggling with the process and actually getting cited in warning letters in FDA 43 for observations relating to their lack of process validation or the incorrect implementation of process validation. It's considered one of the design transfer activities. So this is occurring at the time we're moving from the design of the product into the production of product. And this activity is to ensure or assure that design specifications can be adequately reproduced by the manufacturing process. So what we're trying to do here is show that we can manufacture the product that design would like to have us manufacture. Before we can implement or begin our process validation process, we must have a successfully completed design verification. That is, we must have an indication that our product as designed does meet those design input specifications that we originally started out to do. Also, the product that we create as part of our PQ phase, and we'll talk about what that is in a few minutes, of process validation is that product that would be used to perform our design validation. So there is some intimate linkage between the design process and the manufacturing process through process validation. And I've kind of drawn a little bit of a flow chart here to help illustrate some of these connections. If we go to the top there, and everything I've highlighted in yellow is a document, by the way, here. At the top, I mentioned that we must have a completed design verification before we can start process validation, so we'll start with that step there. And also, we must have a process validation protocol to follow as we're executing our process validation. So that's another document that we do need to have in order to start process validation. So we have those two documents, and we go over towards the left to the series of blue boxes there. We have process validation. The first step is installation qualification, and that requires, of course, the successful completion of design verification and the protocol that we're going to follow in order to accomplish our process validation. Once we've completed the installation qualification step, and we'll be describing each of these steps in detail as we go through the presentation, then we'll move into the operational qualification phase. And operational qualification has an input, of course, from the installation qualification, but also some more documentation from our process validation protocol, which will guide us on how we're going to perform the OQ, or operational qualification phase. Following successful completion of OQ, then we'll move into the PQ, or the final phase of process validation. And PQ again requires some documentation as well to accomplish this phase. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be producing some actual product during the PQ phase, and that product is acceptable to use in our design validation phase when it meets the specifications. So we would take product from the PQ phase and take that together with our completed design verification report and the design verification protocol, and we'll execute our design validation step. That is the step that shows that the product does meet the user needs. And each of these areas of validation, both process validation and design validation, requires a report at the completion of these activities to indicate those steps that we took and what the results were, and that the results were successful, hopefully. In case we did meet some failures along the way, we have to circle back and go back through those phases of each of these activities that need to be repeated until we do have a successful completion. This is one area that I've found sometimes in doing audits that people have written their validation report and gone ahead and moved into the actual full-scale production, when if you go read the validation report in either the process validation or the design validation, you'll find, in fact, that you did not meet the requirements in the protocol. And, of course, this is a case for a violation of the FDA regulations, is putting product on the market that does not meet requirements, that is adulterated then, and you would be cited for that and susceptible to a warning letter. Now, on the process validation side, when we do have a successful process validation report, then we're able to enter full-scale production at that point, and we can produce product. However, we cannot release that product to sale until we've completed two other activities. One is, of course, the design validation and a report that says that's successfully completed, and also our risk management activities. Now, the risk management activities have two parts that have to be completed here. One, in design verification, we completed verification of implementation of all our risk control measures, and that's input into the risk traceability summary. And out of the design validation report, we also indicate that the risk control measures that we have implemented are successful. That is, they do meet the requirements that we've established or the estimates that we've established for our levels of risk. And that would also be entered into the traceability summary. And a completed traceability summary then is entered into the risk management report, as are the results from design validation. And that risk management report is one of the documents that is required to be completed before we release our product to sale. So these processes are all intimately linked together, and just because we've completed all the drawings and specifications and filled up our device master record doesn't mean we're ready to sell product yet. We do have to complete these other phases, the verification of the design and the validation of the process, the validation of the product, and also the verification of our implementation and effectiveness of our risk control measures. So all these things occur late in the process of the design of the product, but they must be completed prior to release to sale. So let's step into the guidance, the regulations, and the standards that can assist us in developing our process validation. That's the subject of today's presentation. Those other areas are certainly important and are the subject of their own presentations. So what we'll find, the main document that's available today to guide us in process validation is the document GHTF/SG3/99-10/2004, which is the second edition of the process validation guidance from the Global Harmonization Task Force. This document is available for free at www.ghtf.org. It's a very important document to have on hand as part of your quality system documents in order to adequately conduct a process validation. The FDA also has a document out there, the Quality Systems Manual, which was written to help manufacturers implement the 21 CFR 820, the Quality System Regulation, when it was released in 1996. And this document, although it's been around a while, does still have some very helpful information. And I've given you the web address for that document. It is free. Again, I would have a copy of that document on hand. For those companies that are creating combination products, that is products that include both devices and either a biologic or a drug, you need to have the guidance for process validation, which was released in 1987, on hand as well, because that is the current document that is being used right now by the drug and device side of FDA. There was a draft released a year ago, but it still hasn't been implemented yet, of a new process validation guidance. So I would be watching for that release of that new document. But at any rate, you will need to have that on hand if you're doing drug and biologic in combination with devices. Of course, in the regulation itself, 21 CFR 820, the Medical Device Quality System Regulation, does have a section on process validation. It's a very short section. It's 820.75. Certainly you need to read that, so you make sure that you do comply with each element of the required documentation you must have on hand. And again, on the CDER and CBER sides, the section there is 21 CFR 211.110, which, interestingly enough, talks about sampling and testing of in-process materials and drug products. So as we start digging through these documents now in the GHTF, and since this is the main document which is applicable to the medical devices, we will spend the majority of our time on this document. There is a definition that tells us that when we do process validation, what we're trying to do is establish by objective evidence that a process consistently produces a result or a product meeting its predetermined requirements. So the objective evidence means we must have some documentation. That is the evidence that the FDA certainly is looking for. Their old saying is, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So we must provide some documentation that, first of all, we established a protocol, and second of all, that we successfully executed that protocol. And we're going to demonstrate that our process that we have created to produce this product consistently produces a result or a product meeting its predetermined requirements. So we're trying to repeat time and time again meeting those design requirements for this particular medical device, whether it be the final product or the components that go into the product. And I might add, it doesn't require, we don't care who those products or components are produced by, whether it is a supplier or the manufacturer. In the end, the manufacturer is responsible for the process validation that is required for that particular product. So we may, in some cases, rely on a supplier to perform the process validation and provide this objective evidence for us that we must have on hand to demonstrate to the FDA that this has been completed. Now, I talk about the FDA here. Process validation is also a requirement of other regulatory bodies other than the FDA. So I will talk about FDA, but imply that we have to meet the requirements of other regulatory bodies as well. Now, in the GHTF document also, another definition is verification, and that's confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that the specified requirements have been met or fulfilled. So again, we have to provide objective evidence, and the process that we use is some type of examination that can be an inspection, a test, or other observation that we can demonstrate that a requirement for a particular product has been met. And of course, we talk about design verification. We talked about that earlier. But verification is also an inspection activity that may take place during the production of our product, and that could be at incoming, in process, or final inspection. It's also a verification activity that may take place during our process validation. In other words, we're following this particular protocol, and we're verifying that that protocol was executed successfully. So we'll provide this objective evidence that this protocol has been actively and successfully completed. The FDA regulation 21 CFR 82075 requires that processes that cannot be fully verified must be validated. So there's a number of processes, and we'll talk about some of those, that can't be fully verified. And an example of a process that could be fully verified is perhaps we're cutting some tubing to length as part of our production activity, and we can measure that tubing and we can see that it does meet that length requirement. So that process would not necessarily have to be validated because we can fully verify that. The process validation regulation also requires that our validated process parameters be monitored and controlled. So once we complete process validation, we must continue to monitor all of those production process parameters, and we must make sure that they remain in control because, of course, our objective here with process validation is to demonstrate we can consistently produce the product that meets our requirements, and the only way we can do that is by keeping our process under control, and we do that by monitoring the process. It does require that validated processes be operated by qualified individuals, and what this means is it's more than just the basic training of some operators on the floor, but rather there must be some specific training that relates to these validated processes so that we can demonstrate that the people that are operating these processes know what they're doing and know or are able to recognize when something is going out of specification and what to do about that. So this qualification requirement is a little bit more stringent than the normal training requirement for a production operator. It also requires in the regulation that any changes that take place to our validated processes require evaluation for revalidation. So if we make a change to a process, perhaps we've got a cost improvement, perhaps we have changed some material along the way, even changing from soft tooling to hard tooling. We need to evaluate that change to make sure it doesn't impact validation. And if it does impact validation, we'll have to perform at least a portion of that validation to demonstrate that we haven't adversely affected the ability of that process to consistently produce product. Okay, I mentioned that we have other requirements beside FDA. If we look at ISO 13485, which of course is the quality system requirement for many other countries in the world, in Japan that is part of the regulation. It has been translated into law. In Europe, of course, there's a harmonized standard there, and if you choose to use it, you must comply with that harmonized standard. In Canada, you're required to use 13485, and there's other countries in the world that do refer to this particular standard. In Clause 7.5.1.1 in this standard, and generally Clause 7 is product realization, it does require that production and service processes, and notice it says production and service, must be planned and carried out under controlled conditions. In 7.5.2.1, it does require the manufacturer to validate production and service, again, processes, when the output of the processes cannot be verified by monitoring or measurement. So in other words, again, this is very similar to the FDA requirement. We do have to provide validation in certain circumstances, not all, but certain production processes. 7.5.2.1 also requires that computer software used for production and service that may affect the product must be validated prior to initial use. And there's one on sterilization, of course. 7.5.2.2 does require that sterilization processes be validated prior to use, and that's in a general requirement in the FDA as well. So in both cases, if we do sterilization, these processes have to be validated. And there are other guidance and standards for validation of both of these areas here. Computer software, there's extensive guidance documents on that, and there are international standards for sterilization processes. Going on, now this is an interesting document here. If you don't have it or have access to it, I'd recommend you might want to obtain it. ISO TR, or Technical Report 14969. And what's this? This is a document that tells you how and the rationale behind the implementation of 13485. So there's some supplemental information in this document that's available to help you as you implement your quality system based on 13485. Now, the numbering of this does follow the numbering of 13485. In fact, this document does include the entire text of 13485 in this document. So if you had your choice of which one to buy, I would buy 14969 and not buy 13485, because all of the requirements from 13485 are located inside 14969, right adjacent to the discussion of each of those requirements. So it says clause 7.5.2.1.1.6. Well, which one is that? Well, the 7.5.2.1.1 is that clause in 13485. And then the .6 is a discussion on that particular clause in 13485. And it does say that cleaning operations that might be required to be validated include those used to remove contamination in manufacturing materials. So if you have a manufacturing process that requires the use of some kind of manufacturing material to expedite it, and some examples might be things like mold releases. It might be some kind of a lubrication product in the manufacturing process that might fall onto the product, or it might be a part, for instance, cutting fluids in a machining process, and it might actually be a cleaning process inside the manufacturing to remove some previously deposited materials on the product. Any of these might need to be validated to make sure that none of the residue of these manufacturing materials or this contamination remains on the product when it leaves our facility. There's a reason for emphasizing this. Not too many years ago, there was a change to a cleaning operation in a company that produced the dialysis filters, and they thought they had done a good thing in manufacturing. They had changed this cleaning fluid to something that was more efficient. Unfortunately, they changed to a fluid which had some results where it remained on the product, got out into use, and in this case, the product was a dialysis filter. It filtered the patient's blood during the dialysis of those patients, and it resulted in the death of 27 patients around the world because this particular cleaning process had not been adequately validated to demonstrate that all of the residue was removed. Okay, going on in the process validation guidance document again, it says process validation is a scrutiny or an examination that has shown our process results are practically guaranteed. And what we're trying to demonstrate here is that a large majority of the product we produce does meet our requirements. And for those of you that are engaged in Six Sigma, they know that, I think it's 6.3 parts per million of product may not meet specifications in a Six Sigma process. Well, that's practically guaranteed. If it's only 6.3 per million, that's pretty darn close. I have seen processes that are much more tightly controlled than that, but in the U.S., oftentimes we're talking about processes that are less controlled, and we may need to improve the capabilities of our process to produce product so that it does meet this higher level requirement. Validated processes are operated in specified limits, and if we do that in these specified limits, it does going to produce product that complies with the requirements. And it does include manufacturing, and of course we said service processes, but notice the word installation here now has been brought up during Global Harmonization Task Force. One of the reasons for including installation is in certain types of medical devices such as CT scanners, MRs, and other devices. Part of the process in producing that product is the actual installation in the facility it's going to be used. And in that case, the installation process has to be validated as well to show that we will guarantee that this product which has been produced, shipped to the customer facility and installed will in fact meet those requirements of that particular product. We certainly don't want to have overdoses in radiation to individuals because something went wrong during the installation. Service process is very similar manner. A company comes in to service a product. We want to make sure that before we expose patients to that product once it's been serviced, that in fact that product does meet the requirements and will not harm the patient. So we want to show that the service processes that we create for service personnel do in fact produce the desired results. The Global Harmonization Process Validation Guidance document does not cover software validation, and again point to several software validation documents that you'll find in the FDA's website that can assist you with software validation inside the product and software validation for quality systems and production processes. Now, process validation, as described in the Global Harmonization Task Force, now is broken down into 3 elements. And there's a similar breakdown in the earlier FDA document, but it wasn't described quite like this. We have 3 phases. The first is installation qualification. And what we want to do here is we want to make sure that the equipment that we're going to use has been properly installed and that we have the services attached to that machine that do meet requirements, things like electricity, water, air, and other services that help that production equipment to produce the product that we need. And what we want to understand, for instance, is if we're out somewhere in the country where we're subject to electrical brownouts, and that has happened in the recent past, we want to understand how our production equipment will respond to those fluctuations in voltage and current that's available to operate that equipment, and when that product will continue to produce good product and when it will not any longer produce good product, so that our operators will know when they experience these brownout conditions what reaction should they do to make sure that the process continues to operate smoothly, or do they stop the process until the conditions are corrected. The next phase is operational qualification, and the idea there is to show that the process will produce acceptable results, and this usually is a short-term operation. This might take a week or something like that to operate and show that, yes, we can, in fact, produce the product that meets those design requirements, the drawings, the material specifications, the functional specs, and so on. So we will operate the process and produce product, and we'll measure that process, make sure we're producing good product. Now, typically what happens during this phase is this is where we dial the process in. We try to find the target operational values for that process so that it will produce good product. And we'll start with a wider range, and then we'll narrow it down until we find what the best spot to operate that process will be. The third and final phase is performance qualification, and that's that step where we set up the long-term process stability. And this is, we're going to run it all shifts, all days, and that sort of thing that process would normally operate. And we're going to demonstrate that it will produce product that meets the requirements day in and day out. So I spoke about a process validation protocol earlier, and a protocol is that document stating how the validation will be conducted, including the test parameters, the product characteristics, what equipment's going to be used, what are the decision points where we decide what constitutes an acceptable test result. So we will describe, for instance, the range of values that are acceptable for the product during this test, and we'll see if we can accomplish meeting those test results. So this is a how-to document. It's how to perform the validation. It might also include things like what equipment's going to be used in the area of test equipment to demonstrate that the results were acceptable. It might describe what are the typical ranges that we might encounter on the utilities and services that provide input to our to our production equipment. So now we've got a protocol. We know there's 3 phases, and we're going to perform that. One of the things I mentioned is statistical tools. Statistical tools are an important part of process validation, and we're going to go through some examples here of some tools that you might find that will be very helpful in performing process validation. It does require a qualified individual to select the proper tools, so you need to have access to someone that has a background and education and training and experience in the use of statistical tools. Those people include people like reliability engineers, statisticians, and you want to choose an industrial statistician. The academic statistician may not be properly exposed to production processes and techniques and may not be the kind of person that would be helpful in this area. Now, the validation protocol must be followed, and so in doing this, we must have established what statistical tools are going to be used when and how within our protocol. So we'll describe the use of those tools. The first of the tools that I find most helpful is the screening designs under design of experiments, and these are described in Six Sigma manuals and so on, and other places like the Duran Quality Engineering Handbook and other places as well. But make sure that it's references that are useful for manufacturing processes. Some of these academic manuals I've found give you a lot of theory, but not much practical implementation of these techniques. So it's always good to have that practical information. Screening designs include 2 that I'm pretty familiar with: Taguchi orthogonal arrays and the Plackett-Berman designs. And these are used to determine what are the key input variables to a process. Now, I was involved in doing a process validation on a printed circuit board process, and we found that when we tried to set up our process validation, we had 32 input variables to our process. And that was going to be a gigantic undertaking until we used our screening design to find that we only had 3 input variables that contributed to the variability in the output. So we're trying to determine what kind of things affect the output of our production process. It might be temperature, it might be humidity, it could be concentration of some particular chemical, it could be a setup of our process, has more impact, and so on. So the screening designs help separate those out. The next tool are the factorial designs, and those are used to set the operating level of those process inputs. So after we have determined what those key process inputs are for our production process, then we use the factorial designs to set the actual operating level of our manufacturing process so that we can reproduce the product. This is an example of a tool that's used to conduct a Plackett-Berman design, and you actually have to run 8 different production runs or batches of material in order to perform this. But during the run of that, we vary these 7 factors that are, this is an 8-run, 7-factor array, and there are others that are larger if you need that. So what you do is you establish 2 levels, a high and a low level for each of your parameters, and that's represented by the plus for the high and the minus for the low. So in run 1, which that's 1 is on the left, variable number 1 will be set at the high level, and spec number 2 is at the high level, and number 3 is at the high level, but variable number 4 we set at the low level, 5 at the high, 6 at the low, and 7 at the low. And then we make a production run, and we measure the output of that production run. And we continue for each of the 8 runs there, and we vary each of the variables according to that chart. And then we take measurements, and we add up those measurements as described in this process. I don't have the time here to go in great detail, but there is information available on the Plackett-Bermans that you can use. And again, Taguchi also does a similar thing so that you can determine what are the key variables, the output, the effect down at the bottom when you perform your math here. You add the sum, the difference, overall sum, the differences, and then you come up with an effect. And the effects that have the highest numerical value are those that are the key variables in the process. And usually you'll have 1 or 2 or 3 that really jump up as maybe 10 times higher values than the others. Okay, once you've done that, then you take your 3, in this case a 3-factor design, X, Y, and Z, X across the bottom and the front, Y up vertically, and Z in the depth there. And you'll set the production process at the corners, the upper and the lower, and then you'll operate the production process and try and find where that optimum level is to get the correct output for the production process. So those are tools to use in the mainly in the OQ phase is where you're going to use this information. Later on, you can use tools like response surface design and evolutionary operations to really fine-tune the processes. This might occur perhaps during PQ, or you could incorporate this in the OQ phase if you really wanted to get the ideal levels established, because that's what you're trying to do, find the ideal settings for the production process. And you end up with some kind of a drawing like this. This was a computer-generated result of a process that had 3 elements to it: time, temperature, and elongation of the particular material that was being manufactured. And in this particular case, the ideal setting was the kind of the shoulder there, or the middle of that red area in the curve. That was the ideal setting of the process. And as you noted, if you moved away from that location, you rapidly changed the kind of results that you were going to get. That elongation would change very rapidly if we change time and temperature, for instance. Evolutionary operations is a kind of another tool, 3-dimensional tool. You start out on the lower left there, next to 78, you'll see an X there, and that's your initial setting of the process, and then you start moving away from that location and seeing what the results might be, and you might move upward from that location and measure the output of the results of that process, and then you might move to the right and continue moving until you find that center hole up there, which is the ideal setting for this kind of a process. And again, you can use software that could computer generate an EVOP result for you. There's a book by George E.P. Box on evolutionary operations, which is a good book. And this allows you both response surface and evolutionary operations. You can perform on an operating process because you're making very small changes at a time in the process until you find that sweet spot that produces the ideal results. Capability studies. Most quality engineers are familiar with process capability studies, and what you're trying to do is make sure the process is capable of operating inside the specification limits, and that is performed in nominal and worst-case conditions. And again, we're trying to see that we can consistently meet specifications, and in this particular case, we've got some normal distributions here. And the first three were outside our specs. The process is not capable, and we make adjustments to our process until we stay inside the specification limits, and we now have a capable process over time. It entails comparing the performance of a process against its specifications. And we want to take the minimum distance between those spec limits and the process mean and divide it by 3 standard deviations to arrive at the measure of process capability. And again, this is there's information on this in Duran. What we're trying to do here, I have the specs here in the turquoise arrows out there at 3 standard deviations away from the center of the process. Now, of the specification 0 is the ideal location, and we have in this case a plus and minus specification that's equal. Not always the case, but in this case it is. And what we've done over time is we've adjusted the distribution of this process. Originally, we might have been in the blue distribution, which ended up producing product outside our specifications, and therefore we're producing some good product, but we've got to sort through some inspection process to find the good product and then to either scrap or rework the product that falls outside spec. So what we try to do is improve the process, and maybe our first improvement was to go to the green distribution, which got most of our product inside the 3 standard deviations, and we produced about 99.73% of our product is good at that point. And that's far less, of course, than 6 sigma. So that's still not desirable, but it is much improved over our blue distribution. Then somebody got in there and tweaked on the process and knocked it off center, and now we're producing a less than half of our product inside the spec, or about half of our product inside the spec limit, and some product outside the spec limit. So this isn't very good. This is not the ideal setting. What we want to drive through is that red distribution, which is very closely clustered around the center specification and stays far away from our spec limits. This is where we produce the best product, and we'll have the less problems with devices in the field. Some years ago, Ford Motor Company had a transmission they were producing at a plant I was associated with in Ohio, and they were also producing a transmission in Japan, and they found that a lot of the transmissions in Ohio were not meeting spec. Or not functioning properly, but as they tore down 250 transmissions, they found that the parts all met spec, but they were widely distributed. They were, some of them very close to the edge of the spec. And they took 250 transmissions in Japan, and they found they were all clustered like the red distribution. They're all tightly clustered around the center, and each one of those functioned properly. So they found that specification that had been developed maybe wasn't accurate, and that the tightly clustered process did get better results. Okay, X-bar and R charts, SPC charts look something like this, and that's a tool that we measure the results of our process once we have it under control. we've established the OQ, and we now operate the process, and we attempt to stay in the green zone in our production process because that's producing good product. This is at red distribution if we're in the green zone there. And then the green distribution would include the red, yellow, and green for our previous drawing of the normal distributions. So at any rate, we want to have a tightly centered distribution, and we can have some variability over time in our production process, but we want the settings to stay inside that green area. So those are all statistical tools we can use in doing the process validation and then following the process validation to keep our process in control. So let's look at which processes do require validation. And here's a list that's in the GHTF document. Sterilization always, clean room ambient conditions, aseptic filling processes, sterile packaging sealing processes always, lyophilization processes, heat treating, plating, plastic injection molding. I'm going to add two here that are not in the GHTF document, which the FDA does insist include welding and soldering. Soldering processes must be validated. So as we're producing printed circuit boards, for instance, for electronics in our products, those processes must be validated. Verification. We can do verification with manual cutting processes. We talked about that tubing. If we're cutting tubing to length, we're manually cutting that, we can verify that. We might do some testing for color, turbidity, or total pH for solutions. We can measure against some standards for those and get suitable results for that. Visual inspection of printed circuit boards. Okay, if those printed circuit boards, there are certain workmanship standards that you can measure those against certification or for verification, but again, the FDA does have some very specific leanings towards, hey, we want those soldering processes to be validated. Now, I think here we're talking about visual inspection of the copper-plated board before the components are installed and soldered. Manufacturing and testing of wiring harnesses. Now, you can do that verification. There's plug boards where you test this wiring harness and you push some buttons, and it measures to see that there are continuity between points and there's a lack of continuity between places where there should not be continuity. Processes which may need validation. So these are the ones you have to think about. Certain cleaning processes, human assembly processes. Now, FDA talks about human assembly processes typically as being qualified and not validated. But there are some human assembly processes that this would be acceptable. Numerical control cutting processes may need validation. Some filling processes where we can't easily verify, we may need to validate. Manual processes I indicated are described as qualified as they're not really validated. You can't produce repeatable results in the same manner as equipment-driven processes because there's a degree of variability here between operators, between shifts, between times of day, before lunch, after lunch, all those kinds of things fit into it. Our manual processes do demand a more highly trained and supervised individual to operate the process. I mentioned that the FDA expects a higher degree of training than a normal production operator that's not operating a validated process. Here's a decision tree to help us decide whether a process needs validation or not. This comes out of the GHTF document. The first step there is to decide, A, is the process output verifiable? If yes, is verification sufficient and cost-effective? If yes, verify and control the process. If either the process output is not verifiable or verification is not sufficient and cost-effective, then it points down to a choice that we have. We can validate the process or we can redesign the product and or the process so that we can get back into verification. So that is always an option for us, is to redesign the product or the process to get around having to validate a process. Of course, this is expensive to do in most cases, late in the design process to go back and redesign. So this step isn't often taken. Okay, risk management. That's a tool that's very important here. The output characteristics for a process being validated, one of your selection criteria could be by reviewing the risk analysis and looking for those items that were identified as risk control measures and those essential outputs identified in design output. The FDA does have a regulatory requirement that designers identify those outputs that are essential for the proper functioning of the medical device, and those should be identified in drawings and specifications. This has been a weak point by companies, however, and you can't always depend on those existing. So you need to use a selection process to determine where we are there. Any characteristic that's essential for proper functioning and affects safety should be selected for validation in processes that require validation. Okay, so IQ. And we're going to step through these three portions here now. IQ, again, established by objective evidence that all the key aspects of the process equipment and the ancillary system installation adhere to the manufacturer's approved specifications. So the process is installed properly. We need to determine what to verify or measure, how many, when, and we need to decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and then what documentation is going to be necessary. So this would be part of our design validation protocol to answer these questions within that protocol. We need to understand the equipment design features, how it's constructed and how it's cleaned, what kind of installation conditions apply here, the wiring, utilities, functionality, and so on. Any calibration that's required, any preventive maintenance required, cleaning schedule required, and we need to set all those up in this phase so that we have the proper maintenance, cleaning, and so on. Any safety features that prevent the operator from being injured, for instance. And the documentation, prints, drawings, and manuals that accompany it needs to be available to people performing IQ. What kind of material is going to be input to the process? Are we using titanium, aluminum, plastic? What is the input? What kind of software is included? What kind of spare parts do we need to keep this thing functioning around the clock, producing our product? What kind of environmental conditions are associated here? Is there a clean room required? Is there temperature and range and humidity range for the process? And what kind of training program and procedures are required for the operators? And here's the questions in the end of IQ. Here's what we should be satisfied. First of all, the equipment was installed correctly. Are the support systems provided and correct, stable and repeatable? Is the process performance affected by variations in the support system? So when the electricity varies, what's our result going to be? Is the equipment level as required? Want to make sure that equipment that's producing parts is producing them to the correct configuration, and most often things that affect that might be things like level equipment. Vibration. Does vibration affect the process? Environment, and again, that's temperature, humidity, and maybe even things like if you have an RF welder in the area, is there RF floating around that might affect the results? May need to perform test runs at the equipment supplier site before you accept the equipment. Want to make sure that it does perform according to the manufacturer's specifications. And we want to analyze the results for assuring that that equipment is okay before we ship it to our company. Oftentimes we do use supplier qualification studies to obtain some basic data and supplement our installation qualification. However, normally it is insufficient to rely only on their validation results for the IQ. We must perform our own IQ at our site. And even if we move the equipment inside the facility, we may need to revalidate, even if we move that equipment 5 feet. We are ultimately responsible as a medical device manufacturer for evaluating the IQ, challenging the equipment, that is testing it over a wide range of its capabilities, deciding whether the equipment is suitable or not. And we may have to make some changes to the equipment or the process as a result of this. So at the end of IQ, we need to make sure that the equipment is installed and operates correctly and that the support systems function as required. Again, our measurement systems are calibrated and capable. That's one that people sometimes miss. They check the calibration of the equipment before they perform the process validation, but they fail to do so afterwards. And what you may need to do is go back and see if the equipment is still in calibration, the test equipment, after the validation, to make sure that we have in fact got acceptable results. Because if the test equipment varies during the validation or it goes out of calibration, then all of our results are suspect at that point. So the next phase, now that we have the equipment properly installed and we know that it's working properly, then we're going to OQ. And OQ is establishing by objective evidence the process control limits. So we're actually going to set up the process controls during this phase and the action levels which result in product that meets all of our predetermined requirements. So this is the key phase here is to establish what these requirements are for the process and that we in fact can meet them with the equipment that we have in place. We need to determine what to verify or measure, how to do this verification and measurement, how many items, what's a suitable sample size, and here again statistical significance is involved. We're going to have to depend upon some person of credibility in the statistical area to help us select suitable sample sizes. We need to determine when we're going to do this verification and measurement. Do we have to sample every hour, every 10 minutes? How often do we need to perform this particular step? Okay, we need to understand what is acceptable and what is rejectable before we start the OQ. And then we need to determine what kind of documentation we're going to have at the end of this OQ process so we can provide that objective evidence that demonstrate that our process is producing acceptable results. So those types of steps are what we're going to need to do here. We're going to challenge the process parameters. What does that mean? Well, we're going to try and adjust over the range that we would expect that equipment to operate and see that it does, in fact, produce acceptable results over that entire wide range. And we're going to allow for the adjustment of the manufacturing process at various action levels. So we're going to set up these action levels. We're going to make sure that, in fact, they do function the way we have designed them along the way. So we have, for instance, a point where we tell the operator that they can adjust the process back to the center. And then we'll perform that operation, and we'll make sure that, in fact, the production process does still continue to produce acceptable results with those kinds of adjustments that we do. Maybe the demand is at a certain level, we stop the process. So we would perform that stop and determine if it's, for producing the correct results. And we need to establish, evaluate, and document those during process validation and describe when the operator should take action, and this should all be written into the procedures for this particular production process. And of course, we need to make sure that our process does function over a wide range and understand what that range is, so we can make sure that we're not operating on the edge of the process and perhaps producing product that doesn't meet our requirements part of the time. So we'll talk about process control limits here. We're going to set those up for whatever those inputs into the production process that affect our output. We're going to look at software parameters, raw material specifications. This is another input into the process, is that raw material that's coming in. What range is that going to operate over? And properly what we want to do is we want to get material that during our process validation activity does vary over that range so that we can see what's going to happen to our process. And then we also have to have those operating procedures, because we want the operator to follow those procedures and see, in fact, if they do work. Talk about material handling. Process change control. Once we have completed this step here, the OQ, we're going to put our process under change control, and we're not going to allow any changes to be made to that process unless they go through the change control process. We're going to do training of our operators from this point forward. We're going to provide, at this point, we've got short-term stability and capability of the process. So we know what's going to happen for a short period of time, but not necessarily a long period. We need to understand what the potential failure modes of a process might be and what kind of action levels and worst-case conditions we might encounter. And some of these may be input back into our product risk analysis if, in fact, they could cause a product risk to the user. Questions. So we need to understand the equipment performs as required. Do the limits operate at the set points? Are the utilities at the right value for the process performance? So we're going to look at all these things at the beginning of this phase. Does the process operate within those stated ranges? Are instruments calibrated? Again, we want to calibrate before and after this phase here to make sure that our instruments are working properly, that we're measuring properly. Are the controlling parameters known? Maintenance activities, and so on. Statistically valid techniques can be used during this phase. And again, this is a quote out of the GHTF process validation guidance. Okay, we're going to use screening experiments as I described earlier, response surface as I described earlier to optimize, and we're going to establish short-term process capability. And so now we know the process can produce product to the requirements. So we have completed our short-term validation. So now we're going to enter the PQ, or the final phase of process validation. And PQ is establishing, by objective evidence, the process under anticipated conditions. And notice that we're not certainly going to anticipate everything, but we need to try to as much as we can. And we want to demonstrate that our process consistently produces a product which meets all of our predetermined requirements. So in advance, we need to know what the specifications are for the output of this process, and we also need to understand that we can consistently meet those specifications. Again, on entering this phase, we need to understand what to verify or measure, how to verify and measure. What we're talking about here is outputs of the process so that we can demonstrate that we have met the requirements of PQ. Again, what should our sample size be? When do we verify and measure? We want to define our acceptance and rejection criteria and define what documentation is required. Same as before. Considerations, actual product and process parameters and procedures were established in OQ. We should be using those. We should understand what's acceptable product and what's not. we should have assurance of a process capability, which was established in OQ. And we're going for process repeatability, long-term process stability. We want this to operate as long as possible without requiring any adjustments in the process. Our challenges, we need to simulate any conditions that would be encountered during actual manufacturing. So if we're doing this in a facility that is not the actual manufacturing facility, then that could change this conditions here and affect it. So we always want to perform this phase in the actual manufacturing facility. And we're talking about actual manufacturing. We may have a short run here that creates a product in a limited quantity, for instance. And it may, later on when we go into full-scale production, we might be running in higher quantities. Our challenges need to include the entire range of conditions as defined by all of our various action levels we decide. Again, controllable cause of variation, much the same as before: temperature, humidity, electrical, vibration, environmental contaminants, and so on. If we're using water in our process, purity. FDA is hot on water in processes, and there's a certain set of requirements for that. You need to pay attention to those. Light, can the operator see properly? Those sorts of things. Human factors, training, ergonomics, stress, and so on. Do we have to periodically change operators because of ergonomics and so on? Variability of our input materials, wear and tear of equipment. We've got normal wear that occurs in tooling, for instance. We can only use injection molds for so many molds before we have to change the molds out. Is the process repeatable? We're looking for a statistically valid sampling plan. We're running multiple runs for repeatability. We can't do this just once and turn it off and say we're done. We have to run multiple runs, and they must be statistically valid number of runs used. And that's based upon what our output is going to be when we run full-scale production. What are those success criteria? Is it going to be a 95% confidence level, 99% confidence level? What is going to be the correct information there? Variation analysis between runs. We're going to look at the different runs and what variables have occurred in between each run. Maybe we'll run one during the daytime, one at night, one on the weekend, whatever. Our monitoring methods we're going to use. We can use a capability study to start demonstrating the process requirements. Our control charts, long-term monitoring to demonstrate it continues to meet requirements. And, of course, we will have established what those specification limits are for the process to keep it in control. Now we're going to make sure that our process can be consistently producing product that meets the requirements. And in these anticipated conditions, we're going to make sure that all process validation documentation is complete, properly filed, and available for future use. Not only will the FDA come in someday and ask to see something, but perhaps you're going to want to make a change in the process, and you need to go back and look at the previous process validation information to find out what went on. We need to establish change control again. We talked about that at the end of OQ. We need to make sure that from this point forward, change control is locked in and no changes can be made in the process without going through that. Continue to monitor using the methods established in process validation. In other words, are we going to use, for instance, SPC, or we have some other tool that we're using to monitor process? Perhaps we have a automated inspection equipment, something like that. Okay, so process changes. Watch out for supplier and material changes. Boy, these things can come and bite you. You don't know they happen, and all of a sudden the process goes out of spec and you don't know why. Cost improvements is always a source of concern. People are trying to reduce costs, and sometimes they take out the controls that are in the process to keep it producing consistently good product. Design changes of the product itself. Certainly we may have to make a process change as a result of that design change. Changes made to the process equipment. Somebody came along and put the latest software revision in a numerically controlled piece of equipment. What's going to be the results of that software change? Do we have to go back and revalidate the process because of that? That's a question we need to ask and make sure that it doesn't affect the product. Any changes to methods, materials, or inputs from previous processes. Maybe we made a change to the way we were processing something upstream, which comes and affects the downstream. So we need to look at that information that's in the file, the process validation file, and make sure that change doesn't negatively impact us. So if we do move or change equipment, if we do automate a process that wasn't automated, if we change a design, if we make a product improvement, we change suppliers, process, or product, we have a recall or sudden product failure, all of those items need to to drive us towards considering revalidation. We need to use the same techniques if we have to revalidate. We need to use the same team if they're still around, or use the same functions to do the revalidation. And before we do a revalidation, we need to have a plan and we need to execute the plan. We need to have a protocol to follow. We may be able to use the same protocol, but a new report with the results from this change. Another reason for revalidation is employee change, company growth. We're all of a sudden going to scale up or scale down the volume of product. If we change the sampling plan, we got new test equipment in, new and better and all that kind of stuff. Newer is not always better. If we change our production method, if we change our production material, if somebody decides the specification is not right and wants to change that, that may be, only may be, a reason for revalidation. We need to consider it. Risk management file. Anytime we get new information that identifies a new hazard or hazardous situation which is not in our current risk analysis, we must update the risk management file. So if we find a new hazard that results from the production process, like we use a new cleaning solution, we need to update the risk management file with that information. And it can come from a process FMEA and the process validation steps. So in summary, process validation is a study with a goal of a controlled process. Process must be understood, demonstrate performance under worst-case conditions. It must be repeatable and reproducible. That's what we're trying to achieve. We must control the documentation and the process changes. We use statistical tools to do this, and it should be part of our quality system. So we should have a procedure in place that tells us how and when to do this. Process validation, and here's a quote from a friend of mine, is understanding and controlling the process through its life cycle using process controls. And this is from Anita Thibault, and she has a book that she wrote on process validation and concepts and applications in 1999. This was released. So this is basically what we're doing. References, World-Class Quality by Keki Boat. That's a great experimental design book. Juran's Quality Handbook. I have the 5th edition. Quality Management Systems Process Validation Guidance. This is the GHTF guidance document. General Principles of Software Validation. We talked about software validation being a requirement. There's a publication on design of optimal multifactorial experiments from Biometrica in 1947. That's where they talk about the Plackett-Berman studies. There's an online source of statistical methods, which is a handbook that's actually online, and it was published by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and it's got a lot of good stuff in it. I would recommend that as well. Anita Thibault's book, ISO TR 8550, helps you use acceptance sampling plans properly. That's available from ISO and may also be available from, well, it's available from ANSI in the U.S., maybe ASQ as well. There's another publication, if you happen to have taken a course from AAMI on quality systems, they have a publication called the Quality System Compendium, and it has some discussions on process validation in that book as well. So we have finished up what I intended to cover in this presentation, so it's time to open up for questions. So I'm going to turn it back to David and let him pick it up here.
Ed, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and also all the participants for cooperating with us. It is now time for the Q&A to begin, and we request all who have questions for a presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of the participants panel to ask your questions verbally. Or if you'd like to post your questions, you could either use the Q&A panel, or you could send your questions to me by chat. And meanwhile, we sincerely request you to share your questions in the feedback form that will appear on your screen in the polling window right now. The feedback form is just 6 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it'll probably take a minute to fill it up. We would be grateful if you could give us your feedback. And Ed, I'm sending you a question through chat. The question is from John.
Does the soldering process require validation if it is fully verifiable? John, the FDA's position is it's not fully verifiable. The only reason it could be, only way it could be fully verifiable from the FDA's point of view, very similar to welding, and you would have to destroy each solder joint in order to prove that it was soldered correctly. And that's their position on this. So they're saying that soldering processes do require validation, but they are not fully verifiable.
Thank you, Ed.
Did that answer your question?
How would you then determine whether or not it's validated? So, like for a soldering process that we are, I guess, bonding 2 components together, would it just have to be tensile values, and is there like a certain requirement?
What you would have to do is establish what the requirements that joint has to adhere to. If this is electrical soldering, there's an excellent source of information. NASA has done some great studies on soldering and publishes workmanship guides and everything else on what good solder joints look like and so on. But still, what you would do in this process is you would perform some soldering according to the validation, and then you would actually perform some destructive testing of certain samples in certain locations on the printed circuit board, for instance, a certain number at each location, and you would demonstrate that each and every time you got acceptable results. Another way, of course, is a pull test, and you would test to see that the joint passed that pull test. So, and what they want you to do is pull to destruction and find out what that destruction level was.
If our solder joint doesn't have, doesn't require any tensile value, it doesn't provide any tensile strength, it's purely, purely electrical, to can't speak right now, but it's purely just to provide electrical contact.
Yes, and again, I would point back to NASA for some great information on that, but there have been demonstrations in the past that something looks good on the outside, but it inside has some problems with it that may provide something like a imperfect connection, which could be producing some erroneous signals and might, over time, fall apart on you. In other words, the equipment in use, some vibrations from that equipment might cause that joint to fail. So they want you to demonstrate that the soldering process does produce all of the joints that meet the requirements of that particular solder joint.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, you could either use the raise hand option if you'd like to ask a question verbally, or post your questions in the Q&A panel. And Ed, there aren't any questions coming. With your permission, could we conclude the session? Would you like to say something before we conclude?
Certainly, David. We have given you a little over an hour session on process validation. This is just skimming the surface. There's a lot more to be learned, and I would expect you to continue your learning activities and look for more sessions provided by Compliance Panel in different subjects here that relate to this topic. But it is something that is very important. The FDA has time and time again cited companies for process validation failures and warning letters because it has led to product becoming adulterated on the marketplace and causing injury to people. So we don't want to do that as medical device manufacturers, and process validation is considered to be a good business practice that helps us make sure that we consistently produce product that meets specifications. I want to thank you for your attention and participation today, and look forward to seeing you in another Compliance Panel presentation in the immediate future. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very grateful for your participation in today's webinar. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email to webinars@compliancepanel.com. And if any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends might benefit from this event, we're happy to inform you that it is available in recorded format and can be purchased from our website, or you could call us at 800-447-9407 or 714-441-5856. We welcome your suggestions and feedback on how we can improve our webinars. If you'd like to get in touch with us or would like to suggest a topic or desire a corporate training online or on-site, we ensure that whatever is your training necessity, it will be a priority. We look forward to having you again sometime soon and for your continued patronage. And on behalf of our presenter, Mr. Edwin Belz, and the Compliance Panel team, I would like to say thank you for participating in this webinar, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead.